Joining me now from Washington is Eli Stokols, a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Eli, thanks for being with us.
Of course.
President Trump says being president is harder than he thought. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that he's faced since taking office?
Yeah, well, that's a reversal from what he told voters all of last year when he said, I'm going to get to Washington, it's going to be so easy. And it's scary, if you think of the country as an airplane and the president is the pilot, you generally don't want the pilot to come on the intercom when you're an hour into the flight and say, flying this thing's a lot tougher than I thought. So it has not been, really something that he has learned yet in terms of adapting his communication approach to this office. And I think that's really hurt him in a lot of ways. We can debate whether or not he's had success with executive orders, whether he's made progress on some of his top priorities, hasn't really done anything legislatively, certainly has signed a lot of executive orders, and some of those have led to action, especially in the area of immigration. But if you step back and you think about the president as a symbol, as the leader of the country, one of his biggest failures, I think, so far is to sort of adapt his approach to leave campaign mode and to turn into governing mode. You see this reflected in his approval number, which is still hovering right around 40%, that he has not expanded really beyond the people who were always with him, his base, his political base. You see that reflected in polling, and I think it's the result of a communications approach and a failure to understand that now you are president of all of us, and to really adapt the message, adapt perhaps the legislative agenda. There are some who think that, had he started with an infrastructure package, maybe he could have gotten bipartisan support, but he started legislatively trying to repeal Obamacare, which has proven very difficult even with Republicans controlling things on Capitol Hill. So I think, there's not a ton to really hold up and brag about so far, aside from the appointment and successful confirmation of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, a 49-year-old conservative who's probably going to sit there for 3 decades or longer. But, I think just generally he has not really adapted the approach from the campaign. Very freewheeling, still watching a ton of TV, still tweeting for himself, and still kind of reacting in an impulsive way to a lot of things. I think a lot of it is noise, but I think it's also still sort of disorienting and dispiriting to people, who, whether they voted for him, sort of saying, well, I'm going to take a flyer on him because I don't like Hillary Clinton, or whether they're against him. And when he became president-elect, they said, well, I hope this works for the sake of all of us. He has not really made inroads with those people beyond his base, and I think that's something that if he's going to be successful, he has to do more going forward.
Well, one thing that we heard constantly during the campaign was that they liked him because he was a very successful businessman, and might that actually be part of his frustrations now? As a CEO, you lay down the law. You might have a board you have to answer to and stockholders, but you're basically the big jefe. He went into office making orders saying that he was going to have 10 pieces of legislation passed in the first 100 days. He's had 0 legislation passed in the first 100 days. Might it be the difference between a CEO and a president with a Congress to answer with?
Right. You can try to run the federal government like a small family business, which essentially is what the Trump Corporation is. It's just not going to work all that well, and I think the president, is getting a very public and sort of humbling civics lesson in his 70s before all of us as a country. We're watching him learn about the checks and balances of an American democracy that most of us learn about in elementary school. So when he signs a bunch of orders and then gets frustrated that an immigration ban gets knocked down in the courts, that was a lesson for him about the judicial branch. You can't just sort of dash off an executive order, say you've checked a box, a campaign promise, and expect that everything's going to be fine just because you say so. Same thing with pushing on the Hill. They tried Obamacare repeal. It didn't work. They tried to come back to it and get a vote on it this week on a revamped bill. That didn't work. This stuff is very hard, and he has sort of overpromised, set expectations very high, and underdelivered to a degree. I think that's part of it. And I think, the quote about this is harder than I thought it would be, in a way, it is a very honest admission of hubris, in a sense of how they came into this, thinking that, we won the election, feeling very validated, we're going to get all this stuff done, we've got a Republican Congress. They definitely underestimated the divisions within the Republican conference on Capitol Hill. They overestimated their own ability to kind of just get up to speed quickly with how to run the government. And so in a way, it's obvious for all of us. It's interesting that he admits that, yes, this is harder than I thought it would be, and this has been a struggle. And I think, from here, they just have to sort of maybe step back and try and slow things down a little bit. They've tried to do a ton of things at one time. This week we saw a bunch of executive orders ahead of the 100-day mark.
Right.
In the first week we saw a bunch of executive orders, including the ill-fated Muslim ban. I think, if they're trying to do big things, a more judicious approach is probably prudent, although that is certainly not, that is not usually how Donald Trump does. It's not really his nature.
And one of the big things that he wanted to deal with was health care, getting rid of Obamacare, but that's a disappointment for him. There's no vote this week on health care, so he will not get that accomplished before tomorrow, his 100-day mark. So who is leading that issue now? Is it, do you think it's the president or is it Speaker Ryan?
I think Speaker Ryan has sort of taken a step back here and is allowing members of, the Freedom Caucus to sort of put forward something that might get them to say yes on the bill, and then they're trying to see now if they can, hold members at the other end of the caucus, the Tuesday group, the more moderate members. And, if they had enough votes right now, we'd have seen a vote this week. They do not have the votes on that. I think the White House recognized from that early failure with Obamacare that they just sort of let Paul Ryan run the show, and that didn't work out all that well for them. You see a slightly different approach on tax reform, where this week, even though the outline was very broad, the White House put out its own one-page outline of what it wants to see in tax reform, and I think the White House will be more active in sort of taking a leading role on that legislative priority. But this is difficult, and I think the more that the White House tries to impose pressure on members of Congress, the more they're going to see that is not really the way that things work. Republicans as a whole, we can blame Donald Trump for this, and we can say, oh, this is a horrible first 100 days. But he is dealing with a very different kind of Congress than presidents dealt with 30 or 40 years ago.
Absolutely.
This Republican conference has been ungovernable for John Boehner, for Paul Ryan, and that was when they were in the minority. The fact that they are now a majority and have a Republican president in the White House, it does not mean that all of a sudden these people are just going to flip a switch and be able to transition and say, okay, now we're going to do a lot of things. They just this afternoon passed a 1-week extension to keep the government running, to fund the government for 1 more week. And I think it's fair to say that is the first real legislative accomplishment of this presidency, although I don't think they're about to throw a party about it.
I don't think they are. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps surprised him the most, is that he has a Republican-controlled Congress, but within that Republican-controlled Congress, he has at least 2 factions, if not more. And that's what's making the health care bill so difficult for him to craft, because they are at opposite ends of the spectrum on certain issues with health care. And to get them together, to be able to pass something like that, he prides himself on his negotiating skills, but you wonder, is he actually taking part? Is he negotiating, or is he trying to lay down the law as the executive in charge?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see him really too involved in the negotiation. His legislative director, Mark Short, has spoken about this bill sort of being a fig leaf of sorts, just giving Republicans some cover for 2018 so they can go back to voters and say, look, we did what we said we were going to do and we repealed Obamacare. I think the fear that a lot of them have is that even something that is small and gives them political cover may do a lot and have a big impact on real people, on some Trump voters, when you're taking an entitlement, even if it's a new entitlement, taking an entitlement away. If people with pre-existing conditions have a harder time getting coverage, that is something that is very real and that Republicans could pay a price for, because even though they will sit there and say, oh, it's Obamacare, we're fixing Obamacare, Paul Ryan will say Obamacare is in a death spiral, Republicans are in charge now, and I think there is some recognition that voters are going to hold them to account for whatever Obamacare looks like in 2018 and in 2020. And so that's what makes this very difficult to really move the ball on. And, had they not spent the last 6 or 7 years telling voters that we're going to do this right away, and scoring political points for saying we're going to repeal and replace it, I don't think they would be trying so hard to repeal and replace something that, if you took Obama off the front end of it and it wasn't called Obamacare, they would just sit there and say, well, it hasn't been perfect, but we're going to move on to other things because, it hadn't been politicized to this degree, and we didn't box ourselves into basically being in this position of having to do something that they said they were going to do for a long time. It's a very difficult thing. When the president last week was asked about this at a press conference with the Italian president, he said, oh, it's going to be a great bill. It's going to be great. Everyone's liking it a lot. It's great, great, great. he couldn't really describe anything about it. And I think it just, this is a guy who has always been able to get away with those kind of glib statements here, but it also betrays a president that I don't think really cares what is in the eventual Obamacare repeal bill. He just wants to get it done and get it over with. And if that's impossible to do, then I think he'll try and move on, as he seemed like he was ready to do after those first 18 days when he just said, forget it, we're on to tax reform, this is impossible, you had your chance.
Yep. Eli Stokols, always interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.